The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly along the cobblestone path. His small hands were clasped behind his back, a habit he had developed when deep in thought. The young prince had always been observant, but, lately, something had been weighing heavily on his mind. Officer James Mitchell had been assigned to Prince George's security detail for 3 years. At 42, James was a decorated veteran who had served in various high-profile protection assignments, but none had touched his heart quite like this one. He watched from a respectful distance as the young prince paused near the rose garden, his shoulders seeming to carry a burden far too heavy for someone his age. George had noticed something that the adults around him seemed to overlook. Every day, the same homeless man sat quietly outside the palace gates. The man never asked for anything, never caused any disturbance. He simply sat there with his weathered face turned toward the sun, clutching a small, faded photograph in his trembling hands. The security protocols were clear and strict. No unauthorized personnel were allowed near the palace grounds. The homeless man, whom the guards had nicknamed Old Charlie, had become a familiar fixture over the past several months. The guards had tried to move him along countless times, but he always returned to the same spot, sitting on the cold pavement with infinite patience. What struck George most deeply was the profound sadness in the old man's eyes. During his daily walks, the prince would steal glances through the ornate iron gates, studying the stranger's face. There was something about Charlie that reminded George of his own great-grandmother, who had passed away the previous year. Perhaps it was the way Charlie's hands shook slightly, or the careful way he protected that precious photograph from the wind. James had noticed the prince's growing interest in the man outside the gates. Initially, he had assumed it was merely childhood curiosity, but, as days turned into weeks, he began to see something deeper in George's behavior. The young prince had started timing his walks to coincide with Charlie's presence, and James could see the wheels turning in the boy's thoughtful mind. One particularly cold October morning, George stopped abruptly during his walk. James moved closer, ready to address any concerns the prince might have. But, instead of speaking, George simply stood there, watching as Charlie pulled his thin jacket tighter around his frail shoulders. The old man's lips were slightly blue from the cold, and his hands shook as he tried to shield the photograph from a gust of wind. "Officer Mitchell," George said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have family?" The question caught James off guard. In all his years of protection duty, he had rarely engaged in personal conversations with his charges. But there was something in the prince's tone that demanded honesty. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. I have a daughter about your age, and my elderly father lives with us." George nodded slowly, processing this information. "Do you see them every day?" "Most days, yes. When my duties permit." The prince was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Charlie. "That man out there. He looks very lonely." James followed George's gaze and felt a twinge of something he couldn't quite identify. In all his months of seeing Charlie, he had never really looked at him as anything more than a security consideration. But, seeing him through the prince's eyes, James began to notice details he had previously overlooked. The way Charlie carefully smoothed his gray hair each morning. The fact that despite his obvious poverty, his clothes, though worn, were always clean. The gentle way he spoke to the pigeons that gathered around him. "Perhaps he is, Your Royal Highness," James replied carefully. George turned to look at his protection officer, and James was struck by the maturity in the young boy's eyes. "My father always tells me that with privilege comes responsibility, that we must use our position to help others. Your father is a wise man." "Officer Mitchell, what would happen if someone wanted to help that man? Hypothetically speaking." James felt his chest tighten. He could see where this conversation was heading, and his professional training warred with the growing admiration he felt for this extraordinary young boy. "Hypothetically, Your Royal Highness, there would be many security protocols to consider, many procedures to follow." George nodded solemnly. "But it wouldn't be impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Your Royal Highness. But some things are more complicated than others." Over the following days, James found himself paying closer attention to Charlie. He learned the old man's routine, noticed his habits, and began to see him as a human being rather than a security concern. Charlie arrived each morning around 7, always carrying a small paper bag that contained what appeared to be his meager breakfast. He would sit in the same spot until late afternoon, occasionally speaking softly to himself or to the pigeons. During this time, George's behavior began to change in subtle ways. He started asking more questions about homelessness, about loneliness, about the responsibilities of those in privileged positions. He spent hours in the palace library, reading about charitable organizations and social issues. His tutors reported that he seemed more focused and purposeful in his studies. One evening, as James was completing his shift report, he received an unexpected visit from Prince George. The young boy appeared in the security office doorway, looking unusually formal despite his casual clothes. "Officer Mitchell, may I speak with you privately?" James gestured to a chair, and George sat down with the composed manner of someone much older than his 10 years. "I've been thinking about our conversation," George began. "About that man outside the gates. I've done some research about homelessness in London, and I've learned some very troubling statistics." James listened, impressed despite himself by the thoroughness of George's research and the compassion evident in his voice. "I want to do something to help," George continued. "Not just for him, but I think he could be the beginning of something larger. Something that could make a real difference." "What did you have in mind, Your Royal Highness?" George took a deep breath. "I want to invite him for tea." The simplicity and boldness of the request took James's breath away. In his years of protection work, he had dealt with complex security protocols, international diplomatic considerations, and countless safety assessments. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. A young prince asking to share tea with a homeless stranger, driven purely by compassion and a desire to help. James stared at Prince George for several long moments, trying to process the magnitude of what the young boy was asking. The security implications alone were staggering. Bringing an unknown individual onto palace grounds went against every protocol he had been trained to follow. Yet, looking into George's earnest eyes, James found himself considering the impossible. "Your Royal Highness, I understand your compassion, but you must realize the security concerns." "I know," George interrupted gently. "But isn't that what the security team is for? To find ways to make things possible, not just to say no." The wisdom in those words struck James deeply. How many times had he defaulted to no simply because it was easier, safer, more convenient? The prince was challenging him to think beyond standard protocols, to find creative solutions rather than automatic rejections. "What would you like me to do?" James asked carefully. "Help me understand what would be required. What checks would need to be done? What precautions would need to be taken? I'm not asking you to ignore safety, Officer Mitchell. I'm asking you to help me find a way to do something good while still being responsible." Over the next week, James found himself in an unusual position. He began discreetly gathering information about Charlie, using resources at his disposal to learn more about the mysterious man who had captured the prince's attention. What he discovered surprised him. Charlie's real name was Charles Edward Thompson. He was 73 years old, a former Royal Navy veteran who had served with distinction for 25 years. After leaving the service, he had worked as a school maintenance supervisor until his retirement. According to records, he had lost his wife of 47 years to cancer 18 months ago, and, shortly after, had lost his small flat due to mounting medical debts and his inability to manage alone. The photograph he carried everywhere was of his late wife, Margaret, taken on their wedding day. Charlie had no living relatives, no support system, and had been living on the streets for nearly 8 months. Despite his circumstances, he had no criminal record, no history of mental illness, and no indication of any behavior that would pose a security risk. More importantly, James discovered that Charlie had been a palace guard himself during the 1970s. He had served on the very same detail that James now commanded, protecting an earlier generation of the royal family. This connection gave James an idea. Meanwhile, George's daily observations of Charlie continued. The prince had begun to notice more troubling details. Charlie's cough seemed to be getting worse with each passing day. His movements were slower, more labored. The approaching winter was taking its toll on the elderly man's health, and George's concern grew deeper. One afternoon, George approached James with new urgency in his voice. "Officer Mitchell, have you been able to learn anything about our friend outside the gates?" James had been dreading this conversation, but he also recognized an opportunity. "Yes, Your Royal Highness. Quite a bit, actually. Would you like to hear what I've discovered?" As James shared Charlie's story, he watched George's expression change from curiosity to deep sadness, and, finally, to determination. The young prince sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before speaking. "He served here? He protected my family." "He did, Your Royal Highness. For several years in the 1970s. And now he's alone, with nowhere to go, and we just ignore him?" James could hear the moral struggle in George's voice. The prince was grappling with concepts that many adults never fully understood, The complexity of social responsibility, the failures of systems meant to care for veterans, the simple human obligation to help those in need. Your Royal Highness, I've been thinking about your request, James said carefully. And I believe there might be a way to make it work. George looked up with hope shining in his eyes. What if we approach this not as a random act of charity, but as honoring a veteran who once served the crown? What if this becomes about recognizing his service and ensuring he receives the support he deserves? The brilliance of this approach was immediately apparent to George. By framing Charlie's situation in terms of honoring military service and royal tradition, they could potentially navigate the security concerns while still achieving the compassionate goal George had in mind. How would that work? George asked eagerly. We would need approval from your parents, of course. But if we present this as a formal recognition of Charlie's service, complete with proper security screening and appropriate protocols, it becomes a legitimate royal engagement rather than a security risk. George stood up, pacing the small office with nervous energy. We could invite him not just for tea, but to tell us about his time serving here. We could learn about the palace's history from someone who lived it. Exactly. And in the process, we could assess his needs and connect him with appropriate resources, veteran services, housing assistance, healthcare support. The plan was taking shape, but James knew the real challenge lay ahead. Convincing the palace administration and the prince's parents would require careful planning and compelling arguments. They would need to demonstrate that this wasn't just a child's whim, but a thoughtful initiative that honored royal values while addressing a serious social issue. George seemed to read his thoughts. What's our next step? We need to present a formal proposal. Something that outlines the security measures, the historical significance, and the positive outcomes we hope to achieve. Are you prepared for the possibility that the answer might still be no? George considered this seriously. Officer Mitchell, my great-grandmother always told me that doing the right thing is rarely easy. If it were easy, everyone would do it. The difficulty doesn't change whether it's right. James felt a wave of respect for this remarkable young boy wash over him. In his years of service, he had protected politicians, diplomats, and various members of the royal family. But he had never encountered someone who challenged him to be better, to think beyond the constraints of his position, to remember the human element in his work. Then, let's write that proposal, Your Royal Highness. As they worked together that evening, James realized that something profound was happening. This wasn't just about helping one homeless veteran, though that was certainly important. Prince George was learning lessons about leadership, compassion, and moral courage that would shape him for the rest of his life. And James was rediscovering why he had chosen a career in service in the first place. The proposal they crafted was comprehensive and compelling. It outlined Charlie's military background, his previous service to the crown, and the historical value of his experiences. It detailed security protocols, health and safety measures, and potential positive outcomes. Most importantly, it presented the initiative as consistent with royal traditions of honoring service and supporting veterans. But, as James looked over their work, he realized that the success or failure of their proposal would depend on factors beyond their control. They were asking the royal family to take a risk, to step outside established protocols for the sake of compassion. They were asking adults to trust in a child's moral instincts and to support his vision of what royal service should look like. The next morning would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But, for the first time in years, James felt truly excited about his work. He was no longer just a guardian following orders. He had become a collaborator in something meaningful, something that could genuinely make a difference in the world. The following morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching James's nervous anticipation as he prepared to present their proposal to the senior palace staff. Prince George had requested to be present for the meeting, displaying a maturity that continued to impress everyone around him. Together, they walked through the ornate corridors toward the administrative offices, their carefully prepared documents tucked securely under James's arm. Princess Catherine was the first to review their proposal. She sat in her private study, reading through each page with the careful attention she gave to all matters concerning her children. James watched her expression change as she absorbed the details of Charlie's story and her son's passionate advocacy for helping him. George, she said finally, looking up at her son. This is quite an undertaking you're proposing. Yes, Mom. I know it's complicated. But sometimes the most important things are complicated. Catherine smiled at her son's earnestness. She had always encouraged her children to think beyond their privileged circumstances, to understand their responsibilities to others. Seeing George translate those lessons into concrete action filled her with pride, even as she worried about the practical implications. Officer Mitchell, she turned to James. What's your honest assessment of the security considerations? James had prepared for this question extensively. Your Royal Highness, I believe the risks are manageable with proper precautions. Mr. Thompson's background check revealed no concerning issues. His military service record is exemplary. The biggest challenge is establishing new protocols for this type of engagement. Prince William joined the discussion later that afternoon, having rushed back from his scheduled engagements to review the situation. His initial reaction was cautious, as James had expected. The future king understood better than anyone the importance of security protocols and the potential consequences of deviating from established procedures. Son, William said, sitting down across from George in the family's private sitting room. I admire what you're trying to do. Your compassion does you credit. But you must understand that every decision we make affects not just us, but the institution we represent. I do understand, Papa. But doesn't that institution mean anything if we can't use it to help people? What's the point of all this? George gestured around the elegant room. If we can't make life better for someone who served our family. William exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine. Their son was asking profound questions about the purpose and responsibility of the monarchy, questions that went to the heart of what they hoped to teach their children about their future roles. Meanwhile, Charlie continued his daily vigil outside the palace gates, unaware that his life was being discussed in the highest levels of the British royal household. His cough had worsened noticeably, and James observed with growing concern that the elderly veteran was struggling more each day with the cold and dampness of the approaching winter. During one of his security rounds, James made an unprecedented decision. He approached the palace gates and spoke directly to Charlie for the first time. Excuse me, sir. I'm Officer Mitchell with Palace Security. I wonder if I might have a word with you. Charlie looked up with startled eyes, clearly expecting to be moved along once again. I haven't caused any trouble, have I? I just like to sit here quietly. It reminds me of old times. No trouble at all, sir. Actually, I wanted to ask you about those old times. I understand you once worked here. Charlie's weathered face brightened with surprise and pleasure. Indeed I did, young man. Many years ago now. Served on the protection detail for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Those were good days. As they talked, James was struck by Charlie's dignity despite his circumstances. The old man spoke with genuine fondness about his time at the palace, sharing stories about the dedication required and the honor he felt serving the crown. His eyes grew misty when he mentioned his late wife Margaret, who had been so proud of his position. She used to say I looked so handsome in my uniform, Charlie said softly, touching the faded photograph he always carried. 47 years we were married. Best years of my life. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was a man who had served with honor, who had loved deeply, and who had lost everything through no fault of his own. The injustice of Charlie's situation crystallized James's determination to help Prince George succeed in his mission. When James returned to brief George on his conversation with Charlie, the prince listened with intense attention to every detail. He really served here? He protected my great-grandmother. George asked. He did. With great pride, from what I could tell. George was quiet for a long moment. Officer Mitchell, he's not just a homeless person anymore, is he? He's a veteran who served my family, who lost his wife, who has nowhere to go. He's a real person with a real story. He always was, Your Royal Highness. Sometimes we just need to take the time to see people clearly. This conversation seemed to galvanize George's resolve. He requested another meeting with his parents, this time armed with more personal details about Charlie's story and his connection to the royal family. The second family meeting took place in the evening, after George's younger siblings had gone to bed. The prince presented his case with renewed passion, sharing what James had learned about Charlie's service record, his personal losses, and his current struggles. This isn't about charity, George explained earnestly. This is about honor, about remembering the people who served us, about showing that the crown cares about its veterans. Catherine and William listened as their 10-year-old son articulated a vision of royal service that was both traditional and revolutionary. He was calling for them to honor the past while addressing present needs, to use royal privilege to shine light on social problems that often remained invisible. George, William said slowly, if we agree to this, it can't be just a one-time gesture. You're talking about setting a precedent, about changing how we engage with these issues. Are you prepared for that responsibility? I think so, Papa. I know I'm still learning, but I want to try. And I have good people to help me. George glanced gratefully at James. The decision, when it came, was not immediate. Catherine and William requested time to consult with senior advisors to fully understand the implications and requirements of what George was proposing. They needed to ensure that their son's compassionate instincts could be channeled into something safe, sustainable, and meaningful. During the waiting period, James found himself in an unusual position. Other security officers began approaching him with questions about the situation. Word had spread through the palace staff about the young prince's initiative, and reactions were mixed. Some viewed it as a dangerous deviation from protocol, while others were moved by George's compassion and saw an opportunity to reconnect with the human element of their service. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for 30 years, surprised James by expressing strong support for George's plan. "That boy has a good heart," she told James confidentially. "And, frankly, it's about time someone remembered that our job here is to serve, not just to follow rules. If we can help an old soldier who once served this family, then we should find a way to do it." Her words resonated with James because they reflected his own evolving understanding of his role. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone whose job was to keep threats away from the royal family. But Prince George was teaching him that protection could also mean creating opportunities for positive engagement, for meaningful service that honored both security and humanity. As the deliberation period extended, James noticed that Charlie's condition was deteriorating. The old veteran was spending more time hunched over, clearly struggling with his persistent cough and the increasingly cold weather. James felt a growing sense of urgency, knowing that whatever decision was made needed to come soon. 3 days later, James received an urgent call from the palace medical staff. Charlie had collapsed outside the gates during the night and had been taken to the local hospital. The news hit both James and Prince George like a physical blow. Their careful planning and patient deliberation suddenly seemed painfully inadequate in the face of immediate human need. George's reaction to the news was immediate and decisive. "We have to go see him," he told his parents with quiet determination. "We can't wait for perfect protocols anymore." Princess Catherine found herself looking at her son with new eyes. The young boy who had started this journey with a simple observation about loneliness had evolved into someone willing to take personal action in the face of crisis. His moral conviction was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss. "Sweetheart," Catherine said gently, "visiting someone in the hospital requires even more security considerations than meeting here at the palace." "Then, we'll figure out those considerations," George replied firmly. "Officer Mitchell, can you find out which hospital he's in and what his condition is?" James was already reaching for his phone. The transformation he had witnessed in Prince George over the past weeks had been remarkable, but this moment crystallized something important. The prince wasn't just learning about compassion, he was learning about leadership, about taking responsibility for his convictions, about translating good intentions into meaningful action. Within hours, James had gathered the necessary information. Charlie was at St. Mary's Hospital, suffering from pneumonia and severe dehydration. His condition was stable but serious, and the doctors estimated he would need at least a week of treatment before he could be discharged. The bigger problem was that he had nowhere to go upon release. This information prompted an emergency family meeting that included not just George's parents, but also several senior palace advisors and security officials. The situation had evolved beyond a simple request for tea. It had become a real-time crisis requiring immediate decisions about royal engagement with social issues. "Your Royal Highnesses," said Sir Robert, the palace's chief administrative officer, "were facing an unprecedented situation. The media attention alone could be significant." "What kind of media attention?" George asked, surprising the adults with his direct participation in the discussion. "Well, Your Highness," Sir Robert continued, "if word gets out that you're visiting a homeless veteran in the hospital, it could generate substantial coverage. That brings both opportunities and risks." George considered this thoughtfully. What if we use that attention for good? What if instead of hiding from it, we use it to help other veterans who might be in similar situations? The room fell silent as the adults absorbed the implications of what George was suggesting. He wasn't just proposing to help one man. He was envisioning a larger initiative that could address systemic issues while fulfilling royal duties in a meaningful way. Prince William leaned forward in his chair. "George, you're talking about using your position to advocate for veterans' issues. That's a significant responsibility. Are you certain you understand what you're taking on?" "I think I do, Papa. And if I don't understand everything yet, I can learn. But I know I can't learn to do important things by only doing safe things. The wisdom in George's words settled over the room like a challenge. Here was a child calling adults to courage, asking them to step beyond comfortable protocols in service of something larger than themselves. Catherine made the decision that changed everything. We're going to visit him, she announced quietly. We'll arrange proper security, we'll coordinate with the hospital, and we'll do it right. But we're going to do it. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of activity. James coordinated with hospital security and local authorities to ensure a safe visit. Palace staff worked with veterans organizations to understand the broader context of issues Charlie's situation represented. Media advisors prepared statements that would frame the visit in terms of royal commitment to veteran welfare. Meanwhile, George insisted on personally selecting items to bring to Charlie. He chose books about military history, including several about the Royal Navy. He arranged for flowers from the palace gardens, specifically roses from the garden where he had first begun thinking seriously about Charlie's situation. Most meaningfully, he wrote a personal letter expressing gratitude for Charlie's service and explaining how learning about his story had impacted him. When the day of the hospital visit arrived, George surprised everyone by appearing in a formal suit rather than his usual casual clothes. When his mother asked about the choice, he explained simply, "Mr. Thompson served the crown with dignity. I should dress appropriately to honor that service." The hospital visit itself was profoundly moving for everyone involved. Charlie, despite his illness and medication, was fully alert and deeply touched by the unexpected honor. When George entered his room, the elderly veteran struggled to sit up straighter, his military bearing evident even in his weakened condition. "Your Royal Highness," Charlie said, his voice hoarse but clear, "I cannot believe you would take time to visit an old soldier like me." "Mr. Thompson," George replied formally, "it is my honor to meet a man who served my family and my country with such dedication." What followed was an hour-long conversation that none of the participants would ever forget. Charlie shared stories about his time at the palace, describing the dedication and pride that characterized the security detail in those days. He spoke about his late wife Margaret, showing George the faded wedding photograph he had protected so carefully during his months on the streets. George listened with the focused attention that had first impressed James weeks earlier. He asked thoughtful questions about military service, about marriage, about loss, about resilience. The conversation revealed a young person genuinely trying to understand experiences far outside his own privileged world. Perhaps most importantly, George addressed the immediate practical concerns with the same directness he had shown throughout this process. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "when you're released from the hospital, I want to ensure you have proper housing and medical care. We've been working with Veterans Services to arrange support, but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore." Charlie's eyes filled with tears. "Your Highness, I had given up hope of ever being remembered, ever mattering to anyone again. You've given me something precious beyond measure." As they prepared to leave, James noticed something that captured the essence of what had transpired over the past month. Charlie was sitting up straighter, his eyes brighter despite his illness. George was carrying himself with new confidence, the satisfaction of someone who had successfully translated compassion into action. But, perhaps most significantly, every adult in that hospital room had been changed by what they witnessed. The security team had learned that protection could include creating opportunities for meaningful engagement. Palace staff had rediscovered the human element of royal service. Even the hospital workers had been moved by the sight of a young prince treating an elderly veteran with such genuine respect and concern. The visit generated exactly the kind of media attention Sir Robert had predicted, but the coverage was overwhelmingly positive. Stories about Prince George's compassionate initiative appeared in newspapers around the world, highlighting both his personal growth and the broader issues facing homeless veterans. More importantly, the visit sparked inquiries from veterans organizations, homeless shelters, and social service agencies. George's simple act of noticing one man's situation had created a platform for addressing much larger systemic problems. As they returned to the palace, George was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke to James, who had become his collaborator and mentor throughout this journey. "Officer Mitchell, I think I understand something now about what it means to serve. It's not just about ceremony and tradition. It's about using whatever power you have to make life better for people who need help." James nodded, recognizing that he had witnessed something rare. The moment when a young person discovers their true calling and commits to pursuing it with courage and determination. 6 months after that transformative hospital visit, Kensington Palace had become the headquarters for an unprecedented royal initiative focused on veteran welfare and homelessness prevention. Prince George, now 11 years old, had not only helped save Charlie Thompson's life, but had sparked a movement that was changing how the royal family engaged with social issues. Charlie himself had become a symbol of successful intervention and recovery. With proper housing arranged through veteran services and regular medical care ensuring his health, he had transformed from a desperate man on the streets to a dignified advocate for homeless veterans. His story, carefully shared with his permission, had helped raise awareness and funds for numerous charitable organizations. The most remarkable development was the establishment of what palace staff had come to call the George Initiative, a formal program that paired royal engagements with systematic efforts to address underlying social problems. Rather than simply attending ceremonial events, George had convinced his family to use royal visits as opportunities to spotlight issues and mobilize resources for lasting solutions. James Mitchell's role had evolved dramatically as well. No longer just a protection officer, he had become coordinator of the George Initiative's security protocols and community outreach. The experience had taught him that truly protecting the royal family meant enabling them to fulfill their highest aspirations for service, not just keeping them safe from external threats. The transformation was most evident in the palace's daily routines. George's morning walks had become opportunities for observation and reflection about community needs. His tutoring sessions now included regular briefings about social issues and charity work. His schedule included weekly meetings with veterans organizations, homeless shelters, and other service providers. Most significantly, George had convinced his parents to institute monthly community engagements, where the family would visit local organizations working on problems they had identified. These weren't traditional royal visits with formal protocols and limited interaction. Instead, they were working sessions where George and his siblings could learn about real challenges and contribute to practical solutions. Charlie Thompson had become a regular fixture at these engagements, sharing his story and helping other veterans navigate the system that had initially failed him. His presence served as a powerful reminder that behind every statistic was a human being deserving of dignity and support. During one particularly memorable visit to a veteran housing facility, George was approached by a young woman whose father had served in Afghanistan before struggling with homelessness and mental health issues. She thanked him for creating awareness that had led to expanded services that helped her father get treatment and housing. "Your Royal Highness," she said, tears in her eyes. "You probably don't remember, but you visited my father in the hospital last year. You spent time talking with him about his service, about his struggles. That conversation gave him hope when he had none left." George did remember the visit, and her father's story of invisible wounds and delayed recognition of trauma that many veterans experienced. What struck him was how that individual conversation had rippled outward, creating connections and resources that benefited many others facing similar challenges. These experiences were shaping George's understanding of leadership in profound ways. He was learning that true authority came not from position or privilege, but from the ability to see problems clearly, to connect with people genuinely, and to translate compassion into systematic action. His tutors reported that his academic work had become more focused and purposeful as he connected his studies to real-world applications. The impact extended throughout the royal household as well. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis had begun participating in age-appropriate volunteer activities, inspired by their brother's example. The palace staff spoke with pride about working for an institution that was actively making a difference in people's lives. Even visiting dignitaries commented on the energy and purposefulness that characterized the family's engagements. Perhaps most importantly, the initiative had begun attracting attention from other young people around the world. Schools reported students starting their own community service projects inspired by Prince George's example. Youth organizations requested partnerships with the royal family's charitable efforts. The combination of privilege and purpose that George represented had become a model for young people seeking to make meaningful contributions to society. James often reflected on how dramatically his own life had changed since that first conversation about the homeless man outside the palace gates. He had discovered that his greatest professional satisfaction came not from following established protocols, but from helping create new approaches that honored both security concerns and humanitarian values. The relationship between James and George had evolved into something resembling mentorship, though it was often unclear who was learning more from whom. George's moral clarity and Determination continued to challenge James to think beyond conventional limitations, while James's experience and practical knowledge helped George translate idealistic visions into workable plans. On quiet evenings, when the day's engagements were complete and reports had been filed, James would sometimes find George in the palace library, reading about historical figures who had used their positions to advance social causes. The young prince was clearly studying models of leadership that went beyond ceremonial functions to embrace transformative action. "Officer Mitchell," George said during one of these evening conversations, "do you think we've made a real difference? Or have we just made ourselves feel better about problems that are much bigger than what we can solve?" The question demonstrated the sophisticated thinking that had developed in George over the past months. He was grappling with the tension between individual action and systemic change, between symbolic gestures and substantive impact. "Your Royal Highness," James replied thoughtfully, "I think you've learned to ask the right questions. And, from what I've seen, people who consistently ask the right questions eventually find ways to create the right answers." The truth was that the George Initiative had already achieved measurable results. Funding for veteran services had increased significantly, partly due to the attention George's advocacy had generated. Several homeless individuals had been successfully housed and connected with support services. Multiple charitable organizations had formed new partnerships that expanded their reach and effectiveness. But perhaps the most important change was less tangible, but more profound. George had demonstrated that privilege could be transformed into purpose, that young people could be agents of meaningful change, and that traditional institutions could adapt to address contemporary challenges without abandoning their core values. As George approached his 12th birthday, plans were already underway to expand the initiative further. Discussions included partnerships with international organizations working on veteran issues, educational programs that would connect young people with community service opportunities, and research projects that would help identify emerging social challenges before they became crises. Charlie Thompson, now serving as an advisor to veteran service organizations, had become a symbol of successful intervention and recovery. His transformation from desperate homelessness to dignified advocacy illustrated the potential for positive change when compassion was combined with practical action and sustained support. The story that had begun with a young prince noticing a lonely man outside the palace gates had evolved into something much larger, a demonstration that authentic leadership could emerge from unexpected places, that individual compassion could create systemic change, and that traditional institutions could find new relevance by returning to their fundamental purpose of service. James Mitchell, reflecting on the remarkable journey he had witnessed and participated in, realized that Prince George had taught him the most important lesson of his career. True security came not from protecting people from the world, but from helping them engage with the world in ways that honored their highest values and aspirations. The silent act of compassion that had begun this story had become a voice for positive change that was being heard around the world, proving that sometimes the most powerful actions begin with the simple decision to truly see another person's humanity and respond with courage, creativity, and commitment to making a difference.